Joining us now is Kevin Williamson of the National Review. He is their roving correspondent at the magazine. He was formerly editor of the Philadelphia Bulletin. He writes the Exchequer blog for National Review, and his books include, his latest book is The End is Near and Is Going to Be Awesome, also The Politically Incorrect Guide to Socialism, and a book called The New Leviathan. Today we want to talk about a terrific article he wrote, which was the cover issue of National Review, entitled I Like Ike. And President Eisenhower, for those of you under 50 and didn't study American history, was elected president, beating Governor Adlai Stevens of Illinois in November of 1952, was reelected, beating Adlai Stevens a second time in November of 1956. And for many people, it was the golden age of America in the post-World War II era. Low inflation, booming economy, and no wars. So I'd like to begin by asking Kevin Williamson, first of all, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I started subscribing to National Review in 1966, and they were very hard on Eisenhower. Bill Buckley was a friend of mine, James Burnham, Frank Meyer. Why were they hard on him, and why do you think it's time to have a different perspective on President Eisenhower?
Well, I think as conservatives, it's okay for us to admit that certain things look better in retrospect. You know, Eisenhower at the time was not nearly as much of a radical as Bill and James Burnham and some of the other people would have liked for him to have been. You know, he had there was a foreign policy wing that wanted him to be much more confrontational with the Soviets, and there was a domestic wing that thought they were going to have an opportunity after the war to basically repeal the New Deal. And Eisenhower, to his credit, didn't take the bait on either one of those losing propositions. You talked about having a low inflation, booming economy, and peace, but he didn't inherit any of those things. When he came into office, of course, there's a war in Korea, there's very high inflation, and the economy is not in very good shape at all. And Eisenhower announces his foreign policy, which he calls waging peace, which you take a little more seriously from the guy who planned the Normandy invasion. And his principles were that we're going to defend real American interests where they are, our national security, the security of our allies, but we're not going to get ourselves caught up in a bunch of what he called brush fire wars, sort of like what we're looking at doing in Syria, things that would deplete not only our credit and our reputation, but also, real material and the public ability to sustain military engagements around the world. And he was a master at it. He was twice called upon to use nuclear weapons, in which both cases he had the good sense to tell people to get lost. He almost allowed, Chiang Kai-shek tried to, provoke us into war with China on his behalf. Eisenhower made sure that didn't happen. He was, extraordinarily deft statesman. And the great thing about Eisenhower, of course, was he made all this stuff look easy. People thought he was just playing golf all day. He was a very, very engaged leader and a very engaged diplomat, and but he had this sort of ease about his manner, and I think that really has to do with his military history. That when he spent the war years juggling Roosevelt, de Gaulle, and Churchill and their egos and their demands, dealing with Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn wasn't such a big deal.
I would tend to agree with that. Well, back in the 70s, Professor Fred Greenstein wrote a book called The Hidden Hand Presidency, which basically stated your proposition that he tried to make it look easy. He was out playing golf, even though he didn't play as much golf as the president incumbent. And he just wanted everyone to feel that everything was floating away okay. When the book came out at the time, both people on the right and people on the left, particularly the left, were like dismissing this because they'd like to. Their hero, the great egghead Adlai Stevens, went down to this inarticulate man, Dwight Eisenhower. But do you think, in retrospect now, Professor Greenstein's hidden hand presidency is the right approach? That he got it right?
There's a lot to that. And Eisenhower wasn't inarticulate. What he was very plain spoken. You go back and read his 1953 speech, The Chance for Peace. This is not the speech of an inarticulate man. There's a story about him at Columbia where he's at dinner with a bunch of professors, and someone makes a joke about, or someone asks him about Churchill and his observation about the soft underbelly of Europe, the southern European countries and how weak they are. And Eisenhower goes on a 45-minute disquisition on the military history, starting with Sparta and the Peloponnesian War and forward to the current day. And all these history professors are sitting around with their jaws open because they think he's a dunce. And they don't know that he has spent, his life studying these things. He was a reader of serious books, a man who spent his time in conversation, not with academics very much, but certainly with serious people. A guy who could stand up to Roosevelt in a conversation, a guy who could stand up to de Gaulle, which he had to in a conversation. And, the idea that he was this, sort of dunce, this kind of grandfatherly figure who liked to play golf and play bridge, which he did, but there was certainly a lot more to him than that. He didn't outrank George Washington when he died for no reason.
Well, that makes a great deal of sense to me. It's interesting to note that, which some people don't, a lot of people miss and no one knows anymore, is that from an intellectual point of view, his mentor was the General Fox Connor,
yes,
who taught him a great deal. And then, of course, he came under the eye of General George Marshall, who kept that famous book. And when you look at Eisenhower, he went from a lieutenant colonel in early 1941 to a five-star general by late 44, early 45.
Yeah.
That's a remarkable career. So it's obvious not only could handle people, he must have had some extraordinary administrative skills that he acquired over time, and that he just had this gift to sit in a room with some of the most obnoxious people, starting with Field Marshal Montgomery, I suppose,
yeah.
and he got through it in one piece. So that says something unto itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, the peacetime army was hard on guys like Eisenhower, because in the peacetime army at that time, promotions happened just strictly on seniority when positions opened up. Eisenhower was a major for 16 years, and then he ends up catapulting in front of 263 more senior officers to move up to his 3-star and then 4-star status over the course of a very short period of time. He kind of chained his way into the job in a sense that he was selected to be the guy to help choose who was going to be the commander of the Allied forces in Europe. And rather than picking someone, once he made his presentation, Roosevelt told him it's got to be him because he was so impressed by him. He was an amazing administrator. And a guy who really understood capital P politics, not necessarily just on the level of winning elections and that sort of thing, which he did and he was very good at, but in dealing with difficult personalities and competing agendas, all of which he knew were legitimate. The French interests there were legitimate, the British interests were legitimate, and everyone else's were as well. And using judgment, using prudence, balancing competing goods, not treating things as though they were obvious, self-evident, black and white kinds of questions. That's a sign of of a first-rate mind at work.
Well, I personally have had a great interest in the post-World War II period through the Eisenhower administration, the Alger Hiss, Chambers fights, etc. But I've noticed, and I've read them all, in the past 18 months, 4 books have come out in Eisenhower. Gene Smith's book, Eisenhower and War and Peace, which I think is the best of the lot.
Terrific book.
Yeah, Jim Newton's Eisenhower, The White House Years, Evan Thomas's Ike's Bluff, and then the Jeffrey Frank's Ike and Dick.
Yeah.
A lot of verbiage on Eisenhower. Do you think there's a revival coming here? What's your sense of it?
Well, I hope so.
You have 1 minute left.
we conservatives, we tend to look back at Reagan. Some of us tend to look back at Lincoln as models for how to do things. But Eisenhower is kind of the model of the modern presidency. First guy to make a television ad while running for president, a guy who was very good at communicating directly with the people and communicating a real sense that he was in control, that things were going to be okay. There was reason to be confident, and that he was on their side and people could trust him. And which is why when he died, he was the most admired single figure in American life, in politics or any other field.
Sounds good to me. I want to thank you for joining us today, Kevin, and I suggest that everyone read his cover piece on National Review, I Like Ike, How Conservatives Got Eisenhower Wrong. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
For those of you, I just say it again. Eisenhower is a person worth studying. His presidency was extraordinary. During a period after the death of Stalin, he was able to take control of foreign policy and did an extraordinary job. And unfortunately, because kids aren't taught things in school anymore, precious few people know that he was president of the United States. So I would recommend that article to you and take a look at some of these books, because I think there's a reason for a genuine revival in the Eisenhower era and the man himself. So take a look at that article. It may inspire you to go on and to read other things. Coming up next is going to be Bill Hammond of the New York Daily News. He's an opinion writer, operates out of Albany. We're going to discuss some of the narcissists that are running for office at this stage of the game. I'm George Mall, and this is the Steve Malzberg Show on Newsmax TV.